Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening at what promises to be a fascinating talk about the history of psychiatry. My name's Karen Blore. I'm a professor of health economics and policy here at the University of York, and it's a privilege for me to be able to chair this evening's Festival of Ideas lecture. So before we get going, just a few technical notes. Firstly, if you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This is available throughout the event, so don't save them up. Write down your questions as you think about them. You can ask at any time, not just at the end. If you have any technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch again, and I'm sure recommend it to all of your friends. And we have subtitles available in this event, so to turn these on or off, there is a button saying CC Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that to turn subtitles on or off. So it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Andrew Scull is a distinguished professor of sociology and science studies at the University of California, San Diego. He has been awarded the Roy Porter Medal for lifetime contributions to the history of medicine and the Eric T. Carlson Award for lifetime contributions to the history of psychiatry. The author of more than a dozen books, which have been translated into more than 15 languages, he's received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Shelby Cullen Davis Center for Historical Studies, among others. I'm delighted to welcome Andrew to talk this evening about his absolutely fascinating book, Desperate Remedies, Psychiatry and the Mysteries of Mental Illness. This book illustrates the assumptions and theory behind the therapy, providing a definitive new account of psychiatry's and society's battle with mental illness. And I'm absolutely looking forward to hearing more about it. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andrew, and welcome, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you ever so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. I'm sorry it's only virtual, but that has some virtues of its own. It allows a broader audience to tune in. So, as Karen mentioned, I am a historian of psychiatry. I've worked on this subject for, unfortunately, about 50 years, which shows how ancient I'm now becoming. My book tries to trace the history of psychiatry from its very beginnings as a specialism within medicine in the early 19th century, right down to the present. We'll see in the space of 40 minutes how much of that 200 years or more of history I can manage to get across, but let me at least make the attempt. And of course, we are talking about a subject that deeply affects very many of us, either because we suffer ourselves from a mental illness or because somebody near and dear to us becomes a sufferer. And even if we escape that, we can't escape the social burdens that mental illness inevitably brings in its train. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about psychiatry for the next 40 minutes, but I want to always keep in the background, and I hope you do as well, that we're talking about suffering people here, and what psychiatry does for and to these people needs to be placed in that context to know that we are in fact talking about our fellow human beings and their sufferings. So psychiatry begins at the very same time as a new solution to the problems of serious mental illness emerges, not just in the United States, which is the major focus of my book, but all across Europe, including in Britain. In the early 19th century. That is a move to institutionalize those with serious mental illness in what were known as retreats, the most famous of them, of course, in your city of York, run by the Quakers, William Tuke and his grandson Samuel. Retreats or asylums. An asylum in those days didn't mean something horrific, not a snake pit. It was intended to be a place of respite and of cure. And in the early years, there was much talk about the possibility of cure, and it was on that basis, in many ways, that politicians were persuaded to invest large sums of money in building asylums where people could be treated at public expense. This was a very utopian movement. In America, it reached the point where psychiatrists were promising they could cure 60, 70, 80% of those they treated, sometimes even more than that. And the initial asylums were quite small therapeutic institutions. But what happened as the century wore on is that it became apparent that these promises of cures had been way oversold. Perhaps rather than 60 or 70 or 80%, perhaps 30 or 40% of people might recover their wits sufficiently to be discharged back to the community. But what that meant was that a large fraction of each year's intake remained behind as chronic patients. And over time, simple mathematics ensured that the new intake was a smaller and smaller fraction of the whole, and more the public image of the asylum and the public image of psychiatry came to be one of incurability and of really persistence of suffering. And that posed a real problem for psychiatry, because having promised so much and delivered so little, people asked, well, why is it that your cure rates are so low? Why is it that mental illness seems to be a life sentence for so many people? And the answer that was developed in the late 19th century was to blame the victim, to assert that mental illness was the product of something which was very much part of the intellectual universe of the late 19th century, that is of evolution, except in this case, evolution had run in reverse. The mentally ill were dismissed as degenerates, as people who had lost essentially their humanity, who were biologically defective, and the reason for locking them up began to change. Rather than the asylum being a place of cure, it was a place where we could keep these people under lock and key and prevent them from reproducing. Because after all, so the psychiatrists at the time argued, if mental illness involved the removal of the constraints of civilized behavior, these people would behave like animals. They reproduce themselves many times over. They would add to a growing public burden. And so best to keep them locked away. That emphasis on degeneration was something that was inherently somewhat unstable. If indeed the mentally ill couldn't be cured, and if they remained a menace to the larger society and a huge economic and social burden, one line of thought was, well, there must be some other way besides isolating them to keep their numbers down. And the solution that emerged in early 20th century America was to sterilize them. And states began to adopt laws that permitted the involuntary sterilization of mental patients. And eventually, one such incident was used to bring a test case to the United States Supreme Court. That case, Buck versus Bell, involved a young woman who was involuntarily sterilized in a Virginia mental hospital. And the Supreme Court, when it heard the case, was led by Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of America's foremost jurists, and it issued an 8-1 decision written by the Chief Justice, which said 3 generations of idiots are enough. The state has a compelling reason to sterilize people, and it is permitted to do so. My state, California, took the lead in doing this, and indeed did not stop involuntarily sterilizing the mentally ill until the 1960s. Now, that still left these people who were a drain on the public purse, as economists saw it, and as politicians saw it, alive. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, very quickly they adopted a sterilization law based on the California statute, as one of the heads of a California mental hospital in Stockton boasted. We pioneered this, and now the Nazis are really putting it to work, because lacking the constraints of a democratic society, and religious groups like the Catholics who opposed this policy of sterilization, the Nazis were able to do this on a mass scale. And then, as the decade wore on, Hitler and his cronies decided that the mentally ill were, as they put it, useless eaters. Why stop at sterilization? Why not kill them all? And with the adoption of the T4 program at the end of the 30s, that's exactly what the Nazis set out to do, with the active collaboration, I may add, of leading German psychiatrists. It was the mentally ill who were the first victims of the final solution. It was there that gas chambers disguised as showers were developed, and the technique of mass killing and burning the bodies was brought into being. And after they had killed 250,000 mentally ill, they packed up the apparatus and the technicians and moved them to the death camps to kill off others they thought unworthy of life. So that was one possible pathway, a dreadful pathway, out of this notion that mental illness was rooted in biology, rooted in the body, and was irremediable. For members of a healing profession, that was a deeply unsatisfactory situation. Some were satisfied with being glorified boarding house keepers, but the more ambitious psychiatrists were unhappy with this state of affairs and cast about for a way forward. And still believing that madness was rooted in the body, they came up with a series of interventions, things I've called desperate remedies, which were then visited upon the captive population shut up in the asylums. Important to see that mental patients were shut up, it seems to me, in a double sense. They were locked away, but they also lost all their rights, and their voices were silenced, because after all, what they had to say was the product of their madness, and hence could be disregarded. And they were enormously vulnerable, and there was a great deal of pressure to do something, do anything, regardless. Now, the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a grand revolution in medicine more broadly. It was the period where the germ theory of disease came to the fore. The laboratory began to play a major role in understanding of disease and intervening in disease, initially primarily, ironically enough, as we live in the era of the anti-vaxxers, this took the form of effective vaccines against awful diseases like diphtheria. So surgery benefited from this new understanding of infection and of bacteria and the importance of keeping it out of wounds. General medicine began to benefit as well. The prestige of medicine rose sharply. And for a time, it was thought that virtually all diseases would eventually be shown to be the product of these newly discovered bacteria and their nefarious effects. Psychiatry had long been the stepchild of medicine, one of the awkward truths about the stigma that clings so closely to those who are mentally ill is that the profession charged with dealing with mental illness shares some of that stigma. We all know all the jokes that circulate about shrinks. But psychiatrists had their own discovery that led some of them to think that maybe this bacteriological revolution also applied to them. Very early on in the development of psychiatry in the 1820s, in France, it had been discovered that there was a subset of mentally ill suffering from something that came to be called general paralysis of the insane, or general paresis. Some people thought that was the end state of all madness. As the century wore on, more and more people began to think, no, it was a separate kind of madness. And then in the early 20th century, laboratory discoveries made clear that it was, in fact, tertiary syphilis. Syphilis, when it first affects a person, is quite obvious, but then it goes underground. Sometimes it attacks the heart, and people drop dead of a heart attack some 20 or 30 years after their infection. But very often it preferentially attacks the central nervous system and the brain. And these patients developed the sense that they were Jesus Christ, or Mary, the Mother of God, or Napoleon, or George Washington, or whatever. So they had powerful psychiatric symptoms and or increasing neurological symptoms, difficulty walking, difficulty articulating, eventually paralysis, and usually a horrible end, choking on their own vomit. And these were a substantial fraction of each year's admissions. In New York State, for example, around 1900, 20 or 25% of male admissions, a rather smaller number of women, were in fact victims of GPI. So when it was discovered that this was caused by syphilis, by infection, some people thought, well, perhaps that explains the rest of madness. We need to look for other sources of it. This was a notion picked up by the leading psychiatrist of the turn of the century, a German named Kraepelin. And one of the people who trained under him was a man named Henry Cotton, who went back to head the state asylum in Trenton, New Jersey. So Cotton seized on this idea and thought it would bring medicine back into the fold, psychiatry, back into the fold with medicine more generally. And he thought, well, what could be going on here? Chronic infections in the body that were being overlooked were, he thought, pumping toxins into the bloodstream and the lymph and poisoning the brain, so that the mad ideas of his patients were purely epiphenomenal. They were a symptom of the fact that the brain had become poisoned. And in the absence of antibiotics, the way forward was something he called surgical bacteriology. That is, cutting out the bits that were infectious. And he launched that campaign by operating on teeth and tonsils quite adjacent to the brain, likely to poison the brain, and many people had rotting teeth. So they were removed and tonsils were removed, and patients stubbornly failed to get better. What could possibly be happening here? Well, Cotton was convinced he knew the answer. The infection had spread elsewhere. People had swallowed the germs. They'd gone down into the digestive system, spread through the body. And so he began to operate, removing stomachs and spleens and colons and cervixes. Particularly, women were the great majority of his patients. And he announced he was curing 80% of his patients using this intervention. And people flocked, rich people flocked from all over the country based on journalistic accounts of this modern miracle. Cotton actually came to Edinburgh to speak to the assembled good and great of British medicine, and he subsequently came to London to do the same thing in 1922 and again in 1927. And he was hailed as the Lister of psychiatry, the man who had moved the mentally ill into a treatable class and had this remarkable new intervention. Even in print, Cotton confessed he was killing 30% of those he operated on abdominally. In reality, events would show it was more like 45% of those who got the most serious operations. And yet, a substantial fraction of psychiatrists jumped on this bandwagon, including people in England, especially in Birmingham, where a man named Thomas Chivers Graves ran all the mental hospitals. And for more than a decade and a half, this intervention proceeded. And even after the leading American psychiatrist of the age, a man named Adolf Meyer at Johns Hopkins University, was told privately as a result of a study done by one of his assistants, just how deadly this intervention was. That report was suppressed, and Cotton, in fact, went to his grave still being hailed as a great pioneer by none other than Adolf Meyer. Now, focal sepsis and surgical bacteriology was only the first of many desperate remedies that came to be tried out in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. One of the great medical miracles, and it was a miracle in the 1920s, was the discovery of insulin, which transformed juvenile diabetes or type 1 diabetes from a death sentence into a chronic illness. But insulin, when administered in excessive quantities, renders people unconscious. It puts them in a coma as their blood sugar levels drop. And a Central European psychiatrist decided, hey, perhaps this is a way we can take people who are mentally unbalanced out of the world for a time, shut down their brains, and put them in a coma or a series of comas, actually, and that will cause them to get over their schizophrenia. And that technique, schizophrenic insulin comas to cure schizophrenia, spread across Europe and across North America. Almost every hospital had one of these facilities, but they were extremely intensive. They required enormous medical and nursing man and woman power because these were people hovering on the brink of death and sometimes not coming back. And it was an enormously frightening and painful and unpleasant process. Again, 80% of patients were cured, so we were told, until controlled studies were done in the 1950s belatedly, and it turned out that insulin comas didn't work at all. Shortly thereafter, still another Central European psychiatrist, Ladislav Madonna, decided that you couldn't be both schizophrenic and epileptic, that epilepsy somehow protected against schizophrenia. And so he thought, well, if we could create artificial epileptic seizures, then perhaps we could cure schizophrenia. And he set about doing that, first in injecting a natural substance, but then moving to a chemical which is known as cardiazol in Europe and metrazole in the United States. And when injected with this substance, patients, as he himself put it, felt as though they were on the brink of dying. And that sensation that someone in a white coat had just injected you with something and you were on the brink of death persisted until a seizure occurred. Sometimes 3 minutes, 5 minutes, sometimes as long as an hour. And then a person seized so violently that very frequently vertebrae and hips were smashed as the muscles contracted violently. Again, this approach was widely adopted, but many were troubled by this interval between stimulus and seizure. And there was a search on for something more reliable. that could be used to produce the same result. And the upshot of that in Italy was discovery that if you put electrodes on either side of somebody's temples and passed an electric current through the brain, people seized. So ECT, as it came to be known, electroshock therapy as it was originally known, was intended as a more humane, reliable way of banishing schizophrenia by creating seizures. Those seizures too broke backs and broke hips and broke other bones and broke teeth, but they were affected very, very rapidly and very cheaply. It was easy to spread this technique, and it did like wildfire. Unfortunately, it turned out ECT, of all the things I'm talking about, is the only one that survives, albeit controversially in the present. Controversially because of its effects on memory, because by now, when ECT is administered, it's administered with a muscle relaxant and with anesthesia, so the fractures I've been talking about no longer happen. But it turns out that this notion that epilepsy and schizophrenia can't coexist is a complete myth. It's false. On the other hand, if ECT works at all, it seems to work not on schizophrenia, but on depression in ways that nobody can explain if they agree that it works. And there are testimonies from many prominent people these days who've undergone ECT that for them, it's been a life-saving intervention. So as I say, very controversial, but still with us. So that's a handful of these desperate remedies. And then in 1935, we had perhaps the most extreme, certainly the most provocative intervention to try to cure serious mental illness. And that was the intervention by a Portuguese neurologist, Agus Moniz, that involved actually damaging the frontal lobes of the brain. This was known as a leucotomy on one side of the Atlantic and a lobotomy on the American side of the Atlantic. And Moniz experimented on a handful of patients and proclaimed he'd had great results. Actually, subsequent research has shown that was emphatically not the case. But in any event, he had at one of the medical conventions that were the frequent way in which medical knowledge was exchanged at the time, at a conference in London in 1935. He had encountered a young American neurologist, Walter Freeman, and stayed in contact with him. And Freeman adopted lobotomy and brought it to America. He wasn't himself a surgeon, so he had a neurosurgeon colleague of his, Jim Watts, perform the actual surgery early on. And these lobotomies were done under local anesthetic, generally, in part because by trial and error, these two had decided that you would stop the lobotomy when the patient started to become confused. And so they would talk a patient through the operation while they sliced brain tissue. And when the patient stopped being able to communicate in a sensible fashion, that's when they would cease lobotomizing people. Now, neurosurgeons were a scarce commodity in these days. It was just emerging as a specialty. They'd only begun to be able to operate on brain tumors and the like. And these operations took hours. And Freeman was very impatient. He wanted to bring what he saw as the benefits of lobotomy to a much broader audience and to mass produce. He wanted to be, as his daughter put it, the Henry Ford of lobotomy. And after the Second World War, he found a technique that he proceeded to use and to teach psychiatrists to employ. And I'm afraid this is very gross, but what he would do is peel back. He would give the patient 2 or 3 ECTs in rapid succession till they were unconscious, peel back the eyelid, insert an ice pick there, bang it with a hammer, wiggle it about, do the same on the other side, put sunglasses on people to disguise their black eyes and say, there, you're all cured. Lobotomy won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1949. It is one of only 2 interventions in psychiatry to win a Nobel Prize. The other was giving patients malaria to allegedly cure their general paralysis. And so that was some 14 years after the first lobotomy. You might have thought there would have been time to realize what the operation was doing to most of the people who were submitted to it. And again, most of them were women. Something like 60 or 70% of all lobotomies were performed on women rather than men. And it persisted well into the 1950s, and there were active lobotomy programs at Harvard University, at Yale, at Columbia University, at Duke University, at University of Pennsylvania, where I once taught. So this was by no means something hidden off in a corner. This was something tens of thousands of people were subjected to, and in England as well, because people came from England to study with Freeman and returned, bringing lobotomy with them. And lobotomies were done here into the 1960s. Here, I mean by the United Kingdom. So what changed? Well, that's a very complicated story, and I realize I have all of about 10 minutes to tell it. So I'm going to be ruthlessly oversimplifying what is a very complicated story. One of the things that happened in America when the Second World War broke out was that psychiatry said, look, there was this terrible thing called shell shock in World War I, where people who'd been trained got into the trenches and then broke down and had to be evacuated, and that caused terrible problems of morale. It was organizationally for the army extremely costly. We could avoid that by screening all the intake into the armed forces so that they are not psychologically vulnerable. They're not likely to break down. And American psychiatry screened out about 1.75 million men as psychiatrically unfit, which was something that suggested to people just how common mental illness might indeed be. But unfortunately, once troops were faced with the horrors of combat, it turned out, not for the first time, that industrialized warfare and people maintaining their sanity are rather incompatible. America's psychiatric casualties in World War II were 2 and 3 times as high as they had been in World War I. And there was an emergency need for more psychiatrists, and there was a recognition that these weren't biologically defective people. They were ordinary people exposed to horror and breaking down under the impact of trauma. And the therapies that were adopted, psychiatrists had to be trained in a hurry. The head of the American psychiatric operation in the military was a man named William Menninger, a Freudian analyst. And these new psychiatrists were trained in psychotherapy and in the idea that mental illness was in fact the product of psychological injuries and conflicts. And after the war, they wanted to keep working in the mental health arena. And so it was that American psychiatry came to be dominated both in the academic centers now training psychiatrists and in private practice, which boomed in post-war America. These were people who adopted the Freudian ideas about mental illness. So the polar opposite. As Leon Eisenberg once put it, this was a brainless psychiatry. It was a psychiatry that ignored the brain and the body. We've gone back actually to what he also talks about as a mindless psychiatry in the present, but that's a story perhaps I'll have time to tell very, very briefly. So psychoanalysis came to dominate high status psychiatry in America. It had outpatients who could generally afford to pay and were willing to pay. And yet, more than 500,000 patients still languished on any given day in America's mental hospitals. That was the despised end of the profession by now. The failures, the people who hadn't learned about Freud and who didn't treat the affluent patients that their colleagues had taken over. But it was within the mental hospitals that the next great change in psychiatry came to the fore. And that was, of course, the advent of the first drugs to treat mental illness, the so-called psychopharmacological revolution that began in 1954. We can date it pretty precisely. That's when thorazine, or Largactil as it was known in Europe, was licensed and began to be prescribed. And shortly thereafter, the so-called minor tranquilizers emerged. Milltown in America, that was something millions and millions of people started taking. And then Valium and Librium in the 1960s. And also the first antidepressants, although depression in those days was seen as a pretty rare thing rather than it is now when it's seen as the common cold of psychiatry. There are apparently 10 million of us or more who are subject to depression, according to modern psychiatry. The antidepressants came about just as thorazine had, just as an accident, a pure piece of serendipity. Somebody was experimenting with a drug to treat people with tuberculosis and noticed that these patients who had a pretty dire prognosis suddenly became happy as clams. And so the notion was born that we could treat depression with a pill. A notion that acquired new currency at the end of the 1980s when Prozac came to market and then the various copycat drugs. And we were all told that you got depressed because you didn't have enough serotonin sloshing around in your brain. So instead of heredity, now we were supposed to see neurotransmitters in the chemical soup in our brain as the solution to understanding madness. Unfortunately, that's a scientific fairy tale. It's good marketing copy for the drug companies. It's become widespread in the popular culture, but its scientific credibility is close to nil. So I'm about out of time. I've got to leave some time for you to answer questions. I haven't really explained how it was that psychoanalysis disappeared, like the Shah of Iran or the communist regime in the old USSR. There were lots of reasons that psychoanalysis collapsed, one of which was it didn't work terribly well for serious mental illness. But in any event, we've moved back into an era of biology. We've also abandoned the mental hospital, and the mental hospital rescued people from jails and prisons. Now we've sent them back there. So the three largest facilities for coping with serious mental illness in the United States are the Los Angeles County Jail, just up the road from me, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island Jail in New York City. And I think at that point I should stop because I believe we're going to have some time for questions. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for what was fascinating, if at times heartbreaking, talk. Thanks so much. We do have questions from the audience, but I'm afraid I'm going to abuse my position in the chair and kick off. You described something that seems to be swinging, if anything, from what you've described as brainless psychiatry to what you describe as mindless psychiatry. How can we find something that is mindful while taking account of the fact that we have a brain?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that is important to bring into the conversation. There are some people who regard the Scientologist being a prime example. Psychiatric drugs and the whole biological psychiatry as a category mistake, as really a poisonous thing to do to people. The reality is a lot more complicated than that. So for some people, antidepressants and antipsychotics turn out to be life-saving. Unfortunately, that's probably a minority. And then there are a group in the middle, because these drugs, Milton Friedman once said, there's no free lunch. When you take pills, you get the good effects, the ones you want, and you get side effects. And in the case of these psychiatric drugs, the side effects are very serious, sometimes life-threatening. So for some people, that balance, that bargain between whatever degree of symptomatic improvement they get and whether they recover is a very complicated one. And then there are a substantial fraction of patients for whom these drugs simply don't work. And worse yet, all the major drug companies have abandoned research on new psychotropic medications and basically left the field for a variety of reasons. So my own personal guess is that indeed it will turn out that the brain will have an important role to play if we ever get to explain mental illness. But I also think it's plain from a whole variety of evidence that social and psychological factors are extremely important as well. And indeed, this whole separation of mind and body strikes me as a serious error. We're born not with a fully formed brain, with a brain that's plastic, that develops and changes for decades after we're born. And the ways in which it develops and changes are heavily conditioned by the social environment, particularly the family in which we grow up. And so over time, the brain kind of embodies our social experiences as well as its underlying biology. So my thinking is that we need to tackle mental illness not in this type of monism, that it's all in the mind, or that type of monism, it's all in the brain. We need to have a much more broad-based approach to trying to understand the mysteries of mental illness.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, to be honest, I've got a whole page of questions here, but it would be unreasonable of me to carry on when I've also got a big list of questions from the audience. So let's take some of those first. So yeah. Simon asks, is psychiatry still a stepchild of medicine? And if not, when did that situation change and why? You described it as a stepchild, I think, right at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah, it's actually varied a good deal. When the asylum system started and there were claims that they could cure such a large fraction of their patients, asylum jobs were plums. They came with a guaranteed salary that the state paid at a time when the medical profession was deeply overcrowded and it was hard to make a living. So at that point, the AMA, when it was founded at the end of the 1840s, asked the psychiatrists to join, and they said, why should we join an impoverished group like you? We're much more successful than you are. Then, of course, they split in. They sort of slid into oblivion. They became seen as boarding house keepers, not people who delivered cures. Again, during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, when psychoanalysis was in the saddle, if you look at Hollywood films, for example, at the time as a kind of indicator of popular culture, you have something like Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound, where the psychiatrist cures her patient, aka her lover, and at the same time unravels the mystery of a murder, all because of the possession of these powerful techniques. Rebel Without a Cause. We can think of a whole Ordinary People by Robert Redford. These all peddle the notion of that. And psychiatrists made more in that period than most medical specialties, psychoanalysts, I should say, not the ones in the state hospitals. They were fairly high prestige. People boasted about the analysts if they were from the New York intelligentsia. Yeah. So, that was a period, and also that was a period, and I know it from teaching some of the people who went into the profession in those years. This was a time when psychiatrists listened to patients. It was a more humanistic endeavor. People thought of therapy as something that could redeem people's lives. But then that turned around. And I think some of that is indeed the product of one of the things I've seen. And I wrote a book on more than 2,000 years of society's encounters with madness in civilization. One of the constants was the degree of stigma and rejection that surrounds mental illness and persists into the present. And that stigma kind of rubs off on the professions who try to manage these awful events. Mm. So I think, yes, once again, they're in a difficult spot.
Indeed. Okay, so Matt asks, can you think of any reasons for optimism?
Oh dear. Yes, I know.
I should perhaps have had that one at the end, but just in case the answer is no, I didn't want to do that.
Well, it's easy to fall into the kind of pessimism that societies did in the late 19th century. And so I think it's important to stress that some of these interventions for some people, while they're no psychiatric penicillin, genuinely do help people. And one has to hope that there will be more interventions. One of the troubles, I'm not anti-drug, but I'm very well aware of the bad behavior of the drug companies, the deceptive science that purports to be evidence-based medicine and is evidence-biased medicine. Nonetheless, with all of that said, there are clearly some people for whom these things are real positive. And so that's one strand of the story. The other strand of the story is that mentally ill people have many needs besides medication that may or may not help them. And when we abandon them, when we put them at the back of the queue because they're very bad, they're not powerful political actors, they're not people who can make real claims on public resources. So when we discharge them without alternatives to the asylum, we don't give them housing, we don't give them social supports of any sort, we're inviting terrible things to happen, and indeed they have happened. So if one's looking for any sliver of optimism, one of the things that needs to change, and it's going to be a very difficult thing to change, is that mental health has to become more of a political priority than it has been for decades. It's, I think, one of the big unanswered questions, whether that's going to prove to be possible. So
it's surprising, isn't it? Given, as you say, how many of us are affected by mental ill health, either as individuals or as members of our family, our loved ones, our friends and colleagues, and as you say, society, that political will hasn't quite been delivered.
Yes, if you look, the NHS briefly got more funding under Blair. Not a man I particularly love, but nonetheless. But when you look at what happened to the mental health services, not much of it trickled down there. And of course, in the last dozen years of austerity and cutbacks, mental illness has tended to, as always, take the brunt of those cutbacks. So it's a really difficult political question. I think, again, the fact that people tend to suffer in silence is mental patients have a hard time organizing themselves for obvious reasons, and their families are often ashamed about the presence of mental illness in their midst. They want to keep it under wraps, and so it's hard to form effective political organizations that lobby for things. Yeah. It's also hard for many people to see exactly what they should be lobbying for.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That's great answer. Casey asked an interesting question with regard to gender differences. She says, with so many women being the ones going through these desperate remedies, why do you think so many mental illnesses and other disabilities like ADHD and autism are diagnosed more frequently in men?
Yes, that's a fascinating state of affairs, isn't it? When the first feminist scholars entered the history of psychiatry with, in many ways, very salutary effects, forcing us to pay attention to something that had been largely ignored. Some of them spoke of mental illness. My friend Elaine Showalter, for example, wrote a book called The Female Malady, claiming that schizophrenia was a female disorder, or at least was perceived that way. I don't think that's true at all. The reality is, for the history I know, men and women were roughly equally liable to come down with serious forms of mental illness. The diagnoses tended to shift by gender, but the overall pattern was pretty common. It's certainly true. I mean, America has an absolute epidemic of ADHD. I think, I forget what the statistics are, but it's something like 15 or 20% of children are on drugs to treat that. And we consume 90% of the world's drugs used to treat that condition. So it must be something peculiarly American, like our stupid gun laws. But the point I would make is that assumptions about female difference have been rooted in Western medicine since the time of Hippocrates. And I think some of what we saw when we're talking about cotton removing organs or Freeman damaging people's brains is the sense that, and some of it is quite open, that women's brains didn't matter as much. I mean, Freeman's feeling was, well, the men have got to go out into the world and earn a living. The women can just become housewives, and you don't need much of a brain to be a housewife. That's Freeman, not me, please, before anybody speaks.
I should hope so.
But he treated his wife accordingly, I should add. He was just a moral monster of a person, in my judgment. So I think those deep-seated prejudices tell us something. I think when women acted out, it was seen as more threatening in some ways than when men did. And so we see this happening again and again. I think actually it's a very powerful feminist point to make when you say, hey, serious mental illness is equally felt among men and women, but women bear the brunt of these experiments. Okay, that's also said. It's more complicated, of course, as things always are. Women tend to consult doctors much more than men. Men disregard the signals that something's wrong, and that's one of the reasons we die faster than the fair sex.
Yes, very true.
So there's some of that. Help-seeking behavior varies by gender. In important ways.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna whiz through a few more because there's loads of questions. I don't think we're going to get through them all, so apologies in advance to anyone I don't get to. There's a couple of questions about how much of psychiatry you've basically discredited in this in this talk. Obviously the historic stuff, but even some of the recent pharmacological stuff. So there's a question from Nikki saying, do you mean to debunk the entire field, or is there anything in it which you consider to be of solid worth?
No, I certainly don't mean to debunk the entire field. And I'm very conscious of the dangers of that. So it's important, I think, not to adopt fantasies, to live in an alternative universe when everything works just fine. losing touch with reality like that is one of the symptoms of mental illness, after all. So I don't want to go down that route. On the other hand, I'm not a Scientologist. I'm not Thomas Saz, who said mental illness is a myth. I believe in its reality. I believe in the suffering that it causes. And I believe that there are many well-intentioned people in both clinical psychology, which I haven't talked about today, and in psychiatry, who are doing their best as they see it to deal with these people's problems, and that some of the time those interventions do indeed help. So this is not something I can glibly deal with in the space of 2 minutes. And all I would say is, if you read my book, I think you'll see I'm highly critical, but I also try to acknowledge the places where I think things have got better and where things genuinely work in people's favor. I, oddly enough, had an email this morning from a psychiatrist at Columbia who said, "I think you've gone too easy on my profession." Well, maybe not.
That's quite a statement.
Yes.
Okay. There's a couple of questions about the psychedelic medications that are currently being sort of experimented with and researched. And indeed, people are self-medicating with them. Do you have any views on that?
Right.
Well, that research and indeed that treatment.
Yes. So we have a variety of things that might be a new variety of desperate remedies around at the moment. Deep brain stimulation, implanting electrodes in people's brains to cure their depression. Ketamine or esketamine, the nasal version. And of course, the various psychedelics, LSD and the like. The scientific evidence for the efficacy of these things is flimsy at best. When deep brain stimulation was put to 2 controlled trials, the trials were stopped early because the results were disastrous. I'm deeply suspicious, but yet, again, one could be surprised. Perhaps one of these things will be helpful for some people. And so careful research, but not people on their own going off and experimenting with things that actually, in the case of psychedelics, can make them permanently psychotic. I'm not here to recommend that. But I also want to stress, I'm a historian. I'm not a clinician. Nobody should come to me for medical advice.
Okay, that's an important point to make. One final question, more along your line. Then you mentioned how popular culture and the films in, I can't remember, was it the 50s, 60s, reflected some of the sort of views of society on mental illness and the treatments of it. But have films and books and popular culture been influential, not just really reflecting society's views, but in influencing society's views on mental illness?
Yes, I think so. I mean, memoirs of people who found their lives, their mental state was improved by Prozac, for example, were a big part of pushing that drug. ECT, the same thing. There are many prominent people who've come forward and said, this saved my life. Simon Winchester, for an instance. So it's still, it's still there. It does obviously have an effect. It's like taking your political advice from Hollywood. Not a good idea.
Fair enough. Thank you, Andrew. There's a big list of questions that I haven't got to, so apologies for to members of the audience who've asked questions that we haven't been managed to get to. But I am instructed firmly to try to finish on time, so I'm going to wrap us up now. Sadly, because I think we could talk about this all night. So. First, let me thank you, Andrew, for what was a really fascinating talk. I mean, you just have to imagine the waves of applause that you would be getting if we were actually in a room now. I'm sorry we can't, sort of transmit that a little bit more really. But anyway, let me tell the audience that the recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June, which is tomorrow, isn't it? You'll get an email when the video is available to view, and you can recommend it to all your friends. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, here it is, Desperate Remedies. I can't recommend it enough. It's a really fascinating read. I've been looking at some of the comments about it, and the words that people use are riveting, required reading from Simon Wesley, dryly witty but always compassionate, and immensely engaging but often dismaying. It's a scholarly book but also a good read, and that's quite an achievement. So highly recommended. And if you'd like to purchase that, it'll be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And you can head to foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. I think the link is in the chat box. There's still another day of the Festival of Ideas that you can engage with. So check out the website, yorkfestivalofideas.com, for full events of what you can do tomorrow. I was looking at it earlier, and there are still some really fascinating things to attend. So do please go to that if you have a little time tomorrow. So yeah, I think it just remains for me to thank Andrew again for a really fascinating lecture. Thank you all for attending and for your great questions, and see you again next year.
Right. Well, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you all.